What defines a monster? Is it the fangs, the claws, the cold, unblinking eyes? Or is it something deeper, something that festers in the human heart, hidden behind a mask of normalcy? The story you are about to hear is a descent into that very darkness. It's a tale so twisted, so profoundly disturbing, it will crawl under your skin and make a home there. It speaks of a depraved loyalty, a hunger that could never be sated, and a secret buried for generations, watered with the blood of the innocent. We are going to peel back the layers of a quiet life to reveal the rot beneath, to a place where man and beast shared a bond forged in murder. This is a story that will challenge your understanding of evil. But before we unlock the door to this house of horrors and introduce you to the man and his pet, do me a solid favor. If you enjoy exploring the darkest corners of the human psyche, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on the chilling tales we unearth here every week. Trust me, you won't want to be alone in the dark for this one. Ready? Then take a deep breath. Let's begin. The music swells and then abruptly cuts, replaced by the faint sound of wind rustling through dead leaves. The house stood like a rotten tooth in the gum line of the rolling, mist-shrouded hills of upstate New York. Penwright Manor was a relic of a bygone era, a Gothic monstrosity of graying stone, sharp gables, and boarded-up windows that stared out at the encroaching forest like vacant eye sockets. It had been built with old money, the kind of wealth that was so ancient it had become synonymous with decay. For the past 40 years, it had been the sole domain of Elias Penwright, a man as reclusive and fossilized as the house itself. And now it belonged to his son, Arthur. Arthur Penwright was not like his father. Where Elias had been a creature of rigid schedules, dusty books, and silent contempt for the outside world, Arthur was a man adrift. He was 42, with a face that had once been handsome but was now beginning to sag with the weight of unfulfilled potential and a quiet, gnawing anxiety. He had spent 2 decades in the city, working a series of uninspired graphic design jobs, living in sterile apartments, and nursing a loneliness so profound it had its own specific gravity. He'd had a girlfriend once, a bright, bubbly woman named Clara, who eventually left because, as she put it, "It's like you're haunted, Arthur, but you're the one holding the sheet." He never understood what she meant until his father died. The heart attack had been swift, leaving Arthur with nothing but a terse letter from a lawyer and a set of antique iron keys. The inheritance was conditional. He was to take up residence in the manor, to become its custodian, and to uphold the family responsibilities. The letter was vague on what those responsibilities entailed, but the accompanying trust fund was substantial enough to ensure his compliance. So he had packed his 2 suitcases, abandoned his lease, and driven upstate, back to the source of the haunting. The first few weeks were a disorienting blend of nostalgia and dread. He wandered the cavernous, dust-choked halls, his footsteps echoing like accusations. He ran his fingers over the spines of his father's books, none of which had been opened in decades. He slept in his childhood bed, which felt both too small and terrifyingly large in the oppressive silence of the house. He was the king of a dead kingdom. The anxiety that had been a low hum in the city became a roaring crescendo in the isolation of the manor. He started talking to himself, his voice sounding alien in the vast, empty rooms. He was beginning to unravel. It was on the 20th day that he found the journal. It was tucked away in a secret compartment behind the fireplace in his father's study, a heavy, leather-bound tome with a tarnished brass lock. The key was on the ring he'd been given, a small, ornate thing he'd mistaken for a decorative fob. His hands trembled as he opened it. His father's handwriting was a spidery, precise script, every word a carefully constructed soldier in a campaign of secrets. The journal didn't begin with "Dear Diary." It began with a statement of purpose. October 12th. Arthur is a man now, though he does not know what that means. He has lived in the world of light and noise, and he is weak for it. But he has the blood, and the blood remembers. He will return to this house as I did, and as my father did before me. He must, for the responsibility is now his. The serpent must be fed. Arthur's blood ran cold. The serpent. He knew what that meant. Vague, nightmarish memories from his early childhood surfaced, memories he had long suppressed as fever dreams. A dark, warm place, a rhythmic, slithering sound, a pair of yellow, unblinking eyes staring at him from the shadows. His father had always forbidden him from going into the deep cellars, the sub-basement that was carved into the very bedrock beneath the manor. With the journal clutched in his hand, he descended. The air grew colder, thicker, smelling of damp earth, ozone, and something else. Something musky and primal. The final door was not wood, but a slab of iron, cool and unforgiving to the touch. He used another key, the largest on the ring, and the lock turned with a deafening groan of protest. The room beyond was vast, more of a cavern than a cellar. The walls were smooth, dark stone, weeping with moisture. The only light came from a series of bare, low-wattage bulbs hanging from a web of ancient wiring, casting long, dancing shadows. In the center of the cavern was a wide, shallow pool of brackish water, fed by a natural spring that trickled down one of the walls. And in that pool, coiled like a fallen god, was the serpent. Arthur had remembered it as being large. He had not remembered this. It was a creature of impossible scale. A reticulated python, he presumed, but of a size that defied biology. Its body was as thick as a tree trunk, its length impossible to gauge as most of it was submerged in the murky water. Its scales were a mesmerizing mosaic of iridescent bronze and obsidian black, shifting and shimmering even in the dim light. Its head, resting on a coil near the edge of the pool, was the size of a small tombstone. And its eyes were the same ones from his nightmares. They were ancient, intelligent, and utterly devoid of anything resembling emotion. They were pits of cold, hungry eternity. It lifted its head slowly as Arthur approached, its forked tongue, black and long as a ruler, flicking out to taste the air, to taste him. A low hiss, like the sound of a slow leak in the world's biggest tire, filled the cavern. Arthur felt a primal fear that bypassed his rational mind and seized his soul. He wanted to run, to scream, to flee the house and never look back. But he was paralyzed, held in place by the weight of the journal in his hand and the python's hypnotic gaze. He was a penwright. This was his inheritance. This was his responsibility. He spent the next week devouring his father's journals, and his grandfather's before that, and so on, going back 4 generations. The library had a hidden section filled with them. The story they told was one of madness and symbiosis. The first penwright to settle here, a shipping magnate named Hezekiah, had brought the creature back from an uncharted island in the East Indies. He believed it to be a demigod, a guardian of the earth's riches. The journals spoke of a pact. The family would care for the serpent, provide for its needs, and in return the family would prosper. And prosper they had. The penwright fortune had survived depressions, wars, and market crashes, always inexplicably insulated from the tides of history. The serpent's needs, however, were specific. In its youth, it had subsisted on livestock. But as it grew, its appetite had changed. It had become more discerning. Arthur found the first entry detailing a human feeding in his great-grandfather's journal, dated 1888. The victim was a vagrant, a man no one would miss. The prose was chillingly pragmatic, describing the act not as a murder, but as a provision. It was a sacred duty, a necessary sacrifice to uphold their end of the bargain. Each successive generation had carried this burden, sourcing their provisions from the lost, the forgotten, the marginalized people who lived on the fringes of society. Drifters, prostitutes, runaway teens, souls who had slipped through the cracks. His father, Elias, had been the most prolific of them all. His journal was a meticulous ledger of abduction and death, with dates, physical descriptions, and brief, detached notes on the provisioning process. Reading it, Arthur felt a wave of nausea so profound he had to retreat to the bathroom and vomit until there was nothing left but bile. This was his family's dark secret. Not just wealth, not just eccentricity, but a legacy of serial murder, all in service to a creature that lived in their basement. For a month, he tried to ignore it. He tried to live a normal life within the abnormal confines of the manor. He ordered groceries online, watched streaming services on his laptop, and pretended that the colossal, carnivorous demigod wasn't living directly beneath his feet. He even tried to feed it. He bought 2 whole pigs from a farm supply store 50 miles away, paying in cash and feeling like a spy in a bad movie. He'd lowered them into the cavern with a winch system his father had built for this exact purpose. The serpent had not even stirred. It had watched the pig carcasses splash into its pool with an air of regal indifference. They rotted there for a week until the stench became so unbearable Arthur had to winch them out and bury them deep in the woods. The journal had an explanation for this. The serpent is not a beast of simple hunger. It feeds on more than flesh. It requires the spark, the vitality, the fear. It requires the essence of a life willingly or unwillingly given. It has been a decade since its last true meal. It will not wait much longer. I feel its impatience in the very foundations of this house. Arthur began to feel it too. A low, resonant hum seemed to emanate from the stones of the manor. The air grew heavy, charged with a palpable sense of expectation. At night, he would be jolted awake by nightmares of a great, coiling darkness, of being swallowed whole, of a hunger that was not his own but that echoed in the pit of his stomach. The house was a part of the serpent, and the serpent was a part of him. He was losing weight. His eyes became sunken, his hands developing a persistent tremor. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. He was sitting in the kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey, when a floorboard in the hall above him creaked. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He lived alone. There was no one else here. He grabbed the heaviest cast-iron skillet from its hook and crept into the hallway, his every nerve ending screaming. He followed the sound up the grand staircase, his breath held tight in his chest. Another creak from the master bedroom. He flung the door open, the skillet raised, ready to strike. The room was empty, but the window, which faced the dense woods at the back of the property, was wide open, the curtains billowing in the night breeze. He could have sworn he'd locked it. As he moved to shut it, he saw him, a man, standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the manicured ruin of the back lawn. He was thin, wiry, dressed in dirty jeans and a hooded sweatshirt. He was staring right at the house, at Arthur. For a moment, they just looked at each other, 2 lonely figures in the vast, indifferent darkness. The man was a drifter, Arthur could tell. He'd seen men like him panhandling in the city, their faces etched with desperation and hardship. The man took a hesitant step toward the house, then another. Perhaps he was looking for a handout, a place to sleep, some shelter from the coming rain. And in that moment, Arthur did not see a man. He saw a provision. The thought was not his own. It was cold, sharp, and utterly alien, yet it had risen from the depths of his own mind. It was the house. It was the serpent. It was the blood that remembered. The hunger that was not his was screaming, demanding, and the face of the man at the edge of the woods was its answer. He didn't remember making a conscious decision. He only remembered the sense of dreadful, inevitable purpose that settled over him. He went to his father's study and opened the locked gun cabinet. He took out the syringe gun, a specialized piece of equipment designed for tranquilizing large animals. His father's journal had detailed its use. He filled a syringe with a potent dose of atorphine from a vial in the cabinet's medical drawer. It was enough to bring down a rhinoceros. He moved through the house with a predator's silence that was entirely new to him. He exited through a side door and circled around the edge of the property, using the overgrown hedges and ancient oaks for cover. The wind was in his favor, carrying his scent away from the man, who was now cautiously approaching the back porch. He was looking for an unlocked door, a way in. Arthur's heart was a frantic drum, but his hands were steady. The tremor was gone. He felt a terrifying clarity, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in his entire life. This was his purpose. He was a Penrite. He was the serpent's keeper. He was 20 feet away when the man heard him. The drifter spun around, his eyes wide with alarm. "Hey, man, I don't want no trouble," he stammered, his voice hoarse. Just looking for a dry place to crash for the night. You found one, Arthur said, and his voice was not his own. It was his father's. It was calm, cold, and final. He raised the gun and fired. The dart made a soft thwip as it embedded itself in the man's thigh. The drifter yelped, more out of surprise than pain. He looked down at the orange-feathered dart, then back up at Arthur, a look of utter confusion on his face. What did you? His words slurred. His knees buckled. The Atorphine was mercilessly efficient. Within 10 seconds, he was unconscious, collapsing onto the damp grass like a puppet with its strings cut. The silence that followed was absolute. All Arthur could hear was the blood roaring in his ears. He had done it. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He stood over the man's inert form, the syringe gun hanging limply at his side. The drifter's face was slack, his mouth slightly open. He looked peaceful. He could have been anyone. He was a nobody. Provision. The rest of the night passed in a fugue state. Following the meticulous instructions left in his father's journal, Arthur dragged the body to the cellar entrance. He strapped it to the winch, the thick leather restraints feeling obscene against the man's worn-out clothes. He opened the iron door to the cavern. The serpent was waiting. It was no longer coiled in its pool. It had moved to the edge, its massive head raised, its yellow eyes glowing with a feverish intensity. It knew. It had been watching, waiting, demanding. The low hiss filled the air, a sound of profound and ancient satisfaction. Arthur worked the winch, his movements mechanical. The unconscious man was lowered into the cavern, his body swinging gently like a gruesome pendulum. The serpent watched his descent, its head swaying from side to side, its long black tongue tasting the air, savoring the scent of the offering. When the body was 10 feet from the floor, the serpent struck. It was a movement of impossible speed, a blur of bronze and black. Its jaws, hinged to open impossibly wide, engulfed the man's head and shoulders. There was a sickening crunch of bone, and then the slow, inexorable process of consumption began. Arthur could not look away. He was transfixed by the horror of it. The serpent's powerful muscles contracted in waves, pulling the body deeper into its gullet. The man's legs kicked for a moment, a final, reflexive spasm, before they too disappeared. Arthur watched the bulge of the body travel down the python's massive throat, a grotesque lump that slowly made its way down the impossible length of the creature. When it was over, the serpent slid back into its pool, only its head and the first 20 feet of its body visible. It stared at Arthur, its gaze no longer hungry, but sated, content. The low hum that had permeated the manor for weeks was gone. The house was silent. The serpent was fed. Arthur stumbled back up the stairs, his legs shaking uncontrollably. He made it to the bathroom just in time to be violently ill again. But this time it was different. It wasn't just disgust. It was a strange, terrifying mix of revulsion and release. The gnawing anxiety that had been his constant companion for years was gone, replaced by a profound and unsettling calm. The haunting had not stopped. He had just finally embraced the ghost. He scrubbed his hands raw, trying to wash away the feeling of the man's rough denim, the clammy coolness of his skin. But he couldn't wash away the memory of the serpent's eyes, of its sated gaze. He looked at his own reflection in the mirror. His face was pale, his eyes wide and dark. He looked like his father. He looked like a monster, and in the terrifying, hollow calm of his soul, he knew this was only the beginning. The serpent was a creature of immense size and slow metabolism, but it would be hungry again, and the responsibility would still be his. Detective Miles Corbin liked the rain. He liked the way it washed the grime from the streets of Kingston, the way it drummed a steady, lulling rhythm on the roof of his Ford Taurus, and the way it gave him an excuse to drink his coffee black and scalding hot. Rain was straightforward. Fell, it cleaned, it moved on. It was everything his job wasn't. For 30 years, Corbin had been a detective with the Kingston PD, and for 30 years, he had waded through the murky, complicated, and stubbornly unclean aspects of human nature. He was 58, with a face that looked like a poorly folded road map, a bad knee that ached when the rain came, and a retirement date circled on his desk calendar that felt more like a parole hearing. He was coasting. He handled burglaries, domestic disputes, the occasional overdose. The big, headline-grabbing cases went to the younger, hungrier detectives. Corbin was fine with that. He had seen enough true darkness to last a lifetime. He was just trying to get to the finish line without any more ghosts clinging to his back. The file that landed on his desk on a soggy Thursday morning was unassuming. A missing persons report. Name John Doe. The irony was not lost on Corbin. The report had been filed by a shelter downtown. A man known only as Slim, real name unknown, presumed transient, had been seen in over a week. He was a regular, a quiet man who kept to himself, never caused trouble. He'd told another resident he was going to try his luck further north, maybe see if he could find some under-the-table work on one of the old estates up in the hills. He hadn't been seen since. Normally, a case like this would be a dead end before it even began. A transient with no last name, no family, no paper trail. He could be anywhere. He could have just moved on. But something in the report snagged Corbin's attention. The shelter manager mentioned that another long-term resident, a woman named Maria, had vanished under similar circumstances about 2 months prior. She too had talked about heading north to find work. 2 missing transients from the same shelter in 2 months. It wasn't a pattern, not yet. It was a coincidence. But Corbin had been a cop long enough to know that coincidences were often just patterns that hadn't found their third data point yet. He sighed. The sound of a man who knew his quiet coast to retirement was about to hit a patch of rough water. He pulled on his worn trench coat, the collar turned up against the relentless drizzle, and decided to take a drive. The shelter was a drab brick building that smelled of bleach and despair. The manager, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, confirmed the details. Slim and Maria, both reliable as far as it went. Both vanished without a trace. People like them, detective, she said, stirring a cup of weak tea. They fall through the cracks. The world doesn't even notice they're gone. Corbin knew she was right, but he had noticed. It was his job to notice. He spent the next few days doing the thankless, tedious work of trying to build a picture of 2 people who had dedicated their lives to being invisible. He talked to other transients, to soup kitchen volunteers, to the beat cops who knew the faces of the street. A fragmented image began to emerge. Slim was a veteran, haunted by his past. Maria was running from an abusive ex-husband. Both were quiet, solitary people who wouldn't have gone with anyone they didn't trust. The only common thread was the vague notion of heading north. Corbin pulled out a map and drew a circle around the area north of Kingston. A sprawling expanse of dense forest, rolling hills, and a handful of small, insular towns. It was also home to the old estates, the decaying monuments to Gilded Age fortunes. Most were now wineries, boutique hotels, or corporate retreat centers. But a few were still privately owned, hidden away behind long driveways and crumbling stone walls. He started with a list of properties that had recently hired seasonal or day labor. He visited landscapers, construction crews, and maintenance companies. He showed around the grainy, low-quality photos of Slim and Maria he'd managed to get from the shelter security camera. No one recognized them. It was another dead end. He was about to shelve the case, to write it off as 2 more sad stories with no final chapter, when a third crack appeared. A teenager. A 17-year-old runaway named Caleb. He had a record for shoplifting and truancy. He'd been staying at a youth shelter, had a fight with his counselor, and stormed out. He'd been missing for 3 days. His file landed on Corbin's desk because the youth shelter was only a few blocks from the homeless shelter where Slim and Maria had stayed. Now Corbin had his third data point. A kid full of anger and bravado, a traumatized veteran, and a woman on the run. They were all different, yet they were all the same. They were vulnerable. They were the kind of people who could be lured away with a promise of cash, a warm meal, a place to stay. They were the kind of people who wouldn't be missed, not by anyone with power or influence. Corbin felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't a series of unfortunate events. This was predation. Someone was hunting on the fringes of his city. Meanwhile, at Penrite Manor, Arthur was discovering a new, terrifying rhythm to his life. After the initial feeding, he had felt a strange sense of peace. The house was quiet. The oppressive, demanding presence that had haunted him was gone, replaced by a deep, sated stillness. For weeks, he lived in a state of surreal normalcy. He read books, tended to the neglected garden, and even tried his hand at painting, something he hadn't done since college. He did everything he could to not think about the cavern beneath his feet or the act he had committed. But the peace was temporary. It was an illusion. The serpent was a living, breathing entity, and its needs were cyclical. About 6 weeks after the first provision, the humming started again. It was faint at first, a subtle vibration in the floorboards, a low thrum he could feel in his teeth. It was a reminder. The serpent was beginning to stir. The hunger was returning. Arthur's anxiety came rushing back, 10 times stronger than before. He couldn't eat. He couldn't sleep. The nightmares returned, more vivid and terrifying than ever. He would dream he was the serpent, his body an endless, coiling muscle, his mind a void of pure, cold hunger. He would dream of swallowing the world. He fought against it. He doubled down on his attempts to find an alternative. He bought live goats, hauling them back to the manor in a rented trailer, the frantic bleating a soundtrack to his desperation. The serpent ignored them. He tried cattle, a massive steer that barely fit on the winch. The serpent watched it with contemptuous stillness. The journal was clear. It requires the spark. The humming grew louder. The house itself seemed to groan with impatience. Doors would creak open on their own. Whispers seemed to echo in the empty hallways. Arthur felt his sanity fraying, his identity being subsumed by the will of the house and its ancient occupant. He was no longer Arthur Penrite, graphic designer. He was the keeper, and the keeper had a duty to perform. His second victim was a woman he found at a truck stop 30 miles away. She was a prostitute, her face hardened by a difficult life, but her eyes held a flicker of desperate hope that Arthur found both pitiable and useful. He told her he was a lonely widower, an artist living in a big, empty house. He offered her $500, not for sex, but just for dinner and conversation. She was wary, but the money and the gentle, sad demeanor he projected won her over. The act was both easier and harder the second time. It was easier because he knew the steps. He knew how to handle the syringe gun, how to work the winch, how to steel himself for what was to come. It was harder because he had to engage with her. He had to sit across from her at his dining room table, sharing a meal he'd cooked, listening to her talk about her dreams of moving to Florida to be closer to her sister. Her name was Maria. He learned this only moments before he pressed the syringe gun to her neck, whispering, "I'm so sorry," as the tranquilizer did its work. The feeding was just as horrific, but his reaction was different. There was no vomiting this time, only a hollow, aching emptiness. The house grew quiet again. The serpent was sated, and Arthur Penrite was a murderer twice over. The third time it was a boy, a runaway thumbing for a ride on the highway. He was angry at the world, full of misplaced bravado. Arthur offered him a ride, then $100 to help him move some old furniture at his estate. The boy, Caleb, jumped at the chance. He boasted about his strength, about how he wasn't afraid of anyone. The fear came later, in the cellar, when he saw the iron door and realized his mistake. He fought, a desperate, wildcat struggle that ended with the hiss of the syringe gun and the boy's defiant sobs turning into a soft, final sigh. With each murder, a part of Arthur died. The man who loved art, who had once dreamed of a life with Clara, who had felt a kinship with the lonely and the lost, was being systematically erased. In his place was the keeper, a being of cold, grim purpose. He was a priest in a profane religion, and his sacrament was human sacrifice. Corbin's investigation was going nowhere fast. He had 3 names, 3 faces, but no connections, no leads, no bodies. The only thing linking them was their vulnerability and their last known direction. North. He spent his days driving the winding country roads, his Taurus eating up the miles. He stopped at every gas station, every diner, every rundown motel, showing the photos, asking the same questions. He got nothing but shrugged shoulders and blank stares. The people who lived out here were private, suspicious of outsiders, and doubly suspicious of cops. He decided to focus on the Penwright estate. It was the most isolated, the most infamous of the old properties. Local legend painted the Penwrights as a family of eccentrics, recluses, and misanthropes. The last of the line, Elias, had been a virtual ghost for 40 years. Corbin learned from the town clerk that Elias had died a few months back and that the property had passed to his son, an Arthur Penwright, who had recently moved in from the city. There was nothing to suggest a connection to the disappearances. It was just a hunch, a nagging feeling in Corbin's gut that had served him well over 30 years. The estate was a black hole on the map, a place of secrets. And Corbin hated secrets. He drove out to the manor one afternoon. The long, winding driveway was overgrown. The iron gates rusted half open. The house itself looked like it had been pulled from a horror movie. Corbin felt a shiver crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. He parked his car and walked up to the massive oak door. There was no bell, only a heavy, tarnished brass knocker in the shape of a coiled serpent. He lifted it and let it fall. The sound was like a cannon shot in the oppressive silence. He waited. For a full minute there was no response. He was about to knock again when the door creaked open a few inches. A man's face appeared in the gap. He looked to be in his early 40s, with haunted, dark-ringed eyes and a pale, drawn face. He looked like a man who was being eaten from the inside out. "Arthur Penwright?" Corbin asked, holding up his badge. The man's eyes flickered to the badge, and for a fleeting instant, Corbin saw a flash of pure, animal panic. Then it was gone, replaced by a mask of weary indifference. "Yes." Arthur's voice was a soft, unsteady whisper. "Detective Miles Corbin, Kingston PD. I'm investigating a few missing persons cases. Just have a few questions for you. Mind if I come in?" Arthur hesitated, his knuckles white on the edge of the door. I suppose," he said, opening the door wider. Corbin stepped into the gloom of the foyer. The air inside was cold, musty, and carried a faint, unidentifiable odor. It was a strange, musky smell, like an old zoo reptile house. The interior of the manor was even more imposing than the outside. A grand staircase swept upwards into the shadows, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors stared down at him from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow his every move. "Can I help you, detective?" Arthur asked, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Just following up on a few things," Corbin said, his tone casual, his eyes scanning everything. "We've had a few people go missing from the city recently. A couple of transients, a runaway kid. The trail runs cold about here. We're checking with all the large property owners in the area. Have you seen anyone suspicious hanging around? Anyone looking for work?" He showed Arthur the photos of Slim, Maria, and Caleb. Arthur glanced at them, his face a perfect mask of non-recognition. "No, I haven't seen any of them," he said, his voice flat. "I keep to myself up here." "I see that," Corbin said, letting his gaze wander around the cavernous hall. "Big place for one person. Elias, your father, he was the same way, I hear. A real recluse." "My father valued his privacy," Arthur said stiffly. "Privacy is one thing," Corbin mused, walking over to a dusty display case filled with what looked like tribal artifacts. "This is another. Must get lonely." "I'm fine," Arthur snapped, his composure cracking for a second. Corbin turned to face him. "Look, Mr. Penwright, I'll be straight with you. 3 people have vanished. They were vulnerable, easy targets. This area is isolated. It's the perfect hunting ground for someone looking to make people disappear. I'm just trying to make sure you're safe, and that you haven't seen anything out of the ordinary." It was a lie, a standard investigative technique. Frame it as concern, see how they react. Arthur's reaction was to retreat further into his shell. "I haven't seen anything. I can't help you, detective." Corbin knew he wasn't going to get anything more. But he had gotten something. He had seen the flicker of panic in Arthur's eyes. He had smelled the strange, reptilian odor that clung to the house, and he had felt the profound, oppressive wrongness of the place. His hunch was solidifying into a cold, hard certainty. "All right, Mr. Penwright, I'll leave you be," Corbin said, handing him his card. "If you do see anything, or remember anything, you call me. Day or night." Arthur took the card, his fingers cold and clammy. He showed Corbin to the door, his relief at the detective's departure almost palpable. As Corbin walked back to his car, he glanced back at the house. He could have sworn he saw a curtain move in one of the upper-story windows, but when he looked again, there was nothing. The visit had terrified Arthur to his core. A detective, here, asking questions, showing pictures of his victims. He had maintained his composure, but just barely. After Corbin left, he collapsed against the door, his heart racing. He had been so careful. He had followed his father's instructions to the letter. Choose the forgotten. Leave no evidence. No witnesses. But he had underestimated the stubbornness of a single world-weary cop. The fear was quickly replaced by a cold, simmering anger. The anger was not directed at Corbin, but at the situation, at the inheritance, at the serpent. The creature in his basement had ruined his life, turned him into a monster, and was now going to get him caught. For the first time, he felt a flicker of rebellion. That night, he went down to the cavern, not with a provision, but with a rifle. It was a high-powered hunting rifle from the gun cabinet, loaded with armor-piercing rounds. The humming had started again, a low, demanding thrum of nascent hunger. The serpent was coiled in its pool, its head above the water, watching him approach. "This ends tonight," Arthur whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and resolve. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, centering the scope on the serpent's massive head, right between its cold, yellow eyes. His finger tightened on the trigger. He could end it all. Kill the creature. Burn the house to the ground. Go to the police and confess. Whatever happened next would be better than this living hell. The serpent did not move. It simply stared at him, its gaze ancient and knowing. And in that moment, Arthur's mind was flooded with something that was not his own thought. It was a feeling, a wave of profound, soul-crushing despair and loneliness that emanated from the creature. It was the collective loneliness of his father, and his grandfather, and all the keepers before him. And it was the creature's own primordial solitude, an existence that spanned centuries, alone in the dark and the cold. The pact was not just about the family's prosperity. It was about companionship. The serpent was not just a god or a guardian. It was a symbiote, and the Penwrights were its other half. His resolve shattered. His finger loosened on the trigger. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. He couldn't do it. Killing the serpent would be like killing himself, like killing the last vestige of his own cursed family. He lowered the rifle, defeated. The serpent dipped its head in a slow, almost imperceptible nod, and slid back into the murky depths of its pool, the ripples of its passage the only evidence it had been there at all. Corbin, meanwhile, couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur Penwright was hiding something. He spent the next 2 days digging into the Penwright family history. He sat in the dusty basement of the county records office, poring over old property deeds, tax records, and census data. He found that the family had always been reclusive, and their fortune had always been mysteriously resilient. He also found something else, a strange pattern of disappearances and unsolved deaths in the area, stretching back over a century. Every decade or so, a few people, always transients, vagrants, or other individuals on the fringes of society, would go missing. The cases were never solved, never connected. They were just chalked up to the transient nature of the victims. But when Corbin laid them all out on a timeline, they coincided with the residency of the current Penwright patriarch. A handful of disappearances during Hezekiah's time, more during his son's, and so on right up to the present day. It was a chilling, improbable pattern. It was the work of a family of serial killers. He had a theory, a wild, insane theory, but it was the only thing that fit. He had no proof, however. No bodies, no physical evidence. A judge would laugh him out of the courtroom if he tried to get a warrant based on a 100-year-old pattern of disappearances and a detective's bad feeling. He needed something concrete. He needed to get inside that house. He decided to pay Arthur Penwright one more visit. But this time he wouldn't be coming to the front door. He would wait for Penwright to leave, and then he would find his own way in. It was illegal, a clear violation of search and seizure laws. Any evidence he found would be inadmissible in court. But Corbin wasn't thinking about a court case anymore. He was thinking about the 3 faces in the photos on his desk, and all the other faces that had been lost to the darkness of that house over the past century. This wasn't about a conviction. This was about stopping a monster. He staked out the manor for 2 days, parked on a dirt logging road a quarter-mile away, watching the gates with a pair of binoculars. On the 3rd day, his patience was rewarded. Arthur Penwright's car, an old, dark-colored sedan, emerged from the driveway and headed toward town. Corbin gave him a 20-minute head start, then drove to the manor, parking his car out of sight. He circled the house, looking for a weak spot. The ground-floor windows were all boarded up or barred. But he noticed a second-story window at the back of the house that was slightly ajar. It was the same one he had seen the curtain move in during his first visit. Using a rickety old trellis covered in dead ivy, Corbin, his bad knee screaming in protest, began to climb. The climb was agony. Every handhold on the rotting trellis sent a shower of splintered wood and dead leaves to the ground. Miles Corbin's knee throbbed with a white-hot, metallic pain, a furious protest against the abuse. He was too old for this, he thought, as he hauled his aching body over the windowsill and tumbled ungracefully onto the floor of what appeared to be a master bedroom. The room was thick with the scent of dust and disuse. For a moment, he just lay there on the threadbare oriental rug, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the adrenaline of the break-in warring with the sheer physical exhaustion of the ascent. This was a young man's game, a fool's game. But as he pushed himself to his feet, the sight of the room reaffirmed his conviction. It was a museum of a dead life, his father's life, that Arthur had left untouched. It was a place of secrets, and Corbin was here to dig them up. He moved through the upper floor with a practiced quiet, his senses on high alert. The house was unervingly silent, yet it felt occupied, watched. The air was heavy and carried that same strange, musky odor he'd smelled in the foyer, stronger here, more pervasive. It was the smell of a predator's den. As he explored, he found the hidden section of the library. A section of bookshelf swung inward to reveal a small, claustrophobic study filled with shelves of identical leather-bound journals. He pulled one down. The date on the first page was 1978. It was his father's. He opened it and began to read. The words were cold, detached, and utterly monstrous. It was a ledger of murder, a meticulous accounting of the provisions he had brought to the serpent. He described the victims, the methods of their abduction, the gruesome details of the feeding. Corbin felt a wave of cold nausea. He had been a cop for 30 years. He had seen the absolute worst of humanity. But this was different. This wasn't the result of passion, or rage, or greed. This was a ritual, a duty, a legacy of madness passed down from father to son. He flipped through more journals, his grandfather's, his great-grandfather's. The story was the same, a century-long chain of human sacrifice. He found the most recent journal, Arthur's. It was thinner than the others, the entries more sporadic and chaotic. The precise, spidery script of his ancestors was replaced by a frantic, scrawled hand. The words were a torrent of self-loathing, fear, and reluctant acceptance. He wrote about the loneliness, the crushing weight of the responsibility, the horror of his first kill. He described Maria. He described Caleb. He described the drifter, Slim. Corbin now had their names. He had the confession. It was inadmissible, poisoned by the illegal entry, but it was the truth. He pocketed the journal. He had what he came for. He knew he should leave, call for backup, and figure out a way to make a legal case. But a morbid, compelling curiosity pulled him deeper into the house. What was the serpent? Where did Penwright keep it? The journals spoke of a cavern, a sub-basement. He found the cellar door off the kitchen. It was thick, solid oak. Locked. He used a lockpick set from his pocket, a tool he hadn't had to use in 20 years. The tumblers clicked, and the door swung inward, releasing a wave of cold, damp air that smelled of wet stone and the now overpowering reptilian musk. He drew his service revolver, its familiar weight a small comfort in the suffocating darkness, and descended the stone steps, using his phone's flashlight to cut a shaky beam through the gloom. The cellar was standard for a house of this age: stone walls, dirt floor, shelves of preserved goods in dusty jars. But at the far end, set into the foundation itself, was the iron door. It was immense, a slab of riveted metal that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. A huge, complex lock was set into its center. This, he knew, was the entrance to the cavern. There would be no picking this lock. As he examined it, he heard a sound that froze his blood. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway outside. Arthur was back. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Corbin. He was trapped. He looked around the cellar, desperate for a place to hide. There was nowhere. Arthur would come down here. He would check on his pet. He would find him. Corbin's mind raced. He could confront him now, try to make an arrest. But Arthur would know he'd broken in. The man was a multiple murderer, clearly unstable. He wouldn't go down without a fight. And Corbin was in his territory, a place of unknown horrors. He heard the front door of the house open and close. Footsteps in the hall above. Corbin made a split-second decision. His only chance was to get out the way he came in. He raced back up the cellar stairs, closing the door as quietly as he could. He crept through the kitchen and into the grand foyer, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear Arthur moving around in the study. He had a few seconds. He took the grand staircase 2 steps at a time, his bad knee screaming. He had to get to the second-floor bedroom, out the window, and down the trellis before Arthur realized he was there. He reached the top of the stairs just as the study door opened. He flattened himself against the wall in the shadowy upper hallway. He could hear Arthur's footsteps crossing the foyer below. He was heading for the cellar. Corbin didn't wait. He ran for the bedroom, flung open the door, and scrambled for the window. He was halfway out, his legs dangling in the open air, when he heard a shout from below. "Hey! Who's there?" Arthur had seen him. Corbin didn't look back. He launched himself onto the trellis, his hands grabbing frantically for a hold. The old wood groaned in protest. He scrambled downwards, ignoring the pain in his knee, the splinters digging into his palms. He was 10 feet from the ground when he heard the crack of a gunshot. A bullet splintered the wood of the trellis just inches from his head. Arthur was shooting at him. He let go, dropping the last 10 feet and landing hard, a bolt of pure agony shooting up from his bad knee. He collapsed onto the ground, his vision blurring for a second. He heard another gunshot, the bullet whining past his ear. He pushed himself up, his leg threatening to buckle, and limped as fast as he could toward the tree line, toward the cover of the woods where his car was hidden. He didn't stop running until the sound of the gunshots faded, and he was deep in the cool, dark embrace of the forest. Arthur watched the detective disappear into the trees, his hands shaking, the rifle hot in his grip. He had seen him. The detective had been in his house, in his father's study. He knew everything. The carefully constructed, monstrous life he had built was about to come crashing down. A part of him felt a profound sense of relief. It was over. But another, deeper part, the part that was no longer just Arthur but the keeper, was filled with a cold, terrifying rage. The detective had trespassed. He had defiled the sacred space. He had threatened the serpent. And for that, he had to be punished. He had to be fed. A new kind of hunt began. Arthur was no longer the reluctant priest. He was the vengeful guardian. He knew the woods around his property better than anyone. He knew the trails, the streams, the places to hide. He retrieved a set of night vision goggles from a supply closet, another, one of his father's contingency tools, and began to track the detective. Corbin was in trouble. His knee was swelling to the size of a grapefruit, and every step was a fresh wave of agony. His phone had no signal this deep in the woods. He was lost, injured, and being hunted by a madman. His only advantage was his experience. He was a cop, but he was also a hunter in his youth. He knew how to move quietly, how to use the terrain to his advantage. The sun was beginning to set, and the woods were sinking into a deep, primeval darkness. It became a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the dark, rain-soaked forest. Corbin tried to circle back to the road where he'd parked his car, but Arthur seemed to anticipate his every move, cutting him off, forcing him deeper into the wilderness. He could hear him sometimes, a rustle of leaves, a snapped twig, a presence in the darkness just beyond his line of sight. He knew Arthur had the advantage. This was his territory. Hours passed. Corbin was exhausted, dehydrated, and losing hope. He found a small rock outcropping and took shelter, pressing his back against the cold, damp stone. He needed to rest, just for a few minutes. He checked his revolver, for bullets left. He listened to the sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, trying to distinguish the natural sounds from the sounds of his pursuer. That's when he heard the slithering. It was a soft sound, but unmistakable. The sound of something impossibly heavy dragging itself over the forest floor. It was coming from the direction of the manor. Corbin's blood ran cold. The serpent. Arthur had let the serpent out. The thought was so insane, so utterly impossible, that he almost dismissed it as a hallucination brought on by pain and exhaustion. But the sound grew louder, closer. It was accompanied by the cracking of undergrowth and the groaning of saplings being pushed aside. Corbin realized the terrible truth. The hunt wasn't just Arthur anymore. He had unleashed his god. Panic gave him a fresh burst of adrenaline. He scrambled away from the outcropping, crashing through the woods with no regard for stealth. He just had to get away. He could hear the slithering behind him, faster than he would have thought possible, an inexorable, terrifying sound that promised a gruesome death. He broke through a line of trees and found himself back on the grounds of the manor, near the edge of the back lawn. The house loomed in the darkness, a black silhouette against the starry sky. He saw Arthur standing on the back porch, watching, the night vision goggles making him look like some kind of demonic insect. And emerging from the shadows of the house, its scales shimmering in the faint moonlight, was the serpent. Corbin froze, his mind unable to process the scale of the creature. It was bigger than he could have ever imagined, a living, breathing leviathan from a prehistoric age. Its head, as large as a man's torso, rose from its coils, its yellow eyes fixing on him, its black forked tongue tasting the air. This was the source of the evil that had plagued this land for over a century. This was the beast at the heart of the labyrinth. Arthur raised his rifle, but he didn't fire. He just watched, a silent observer at the sacrifice. He had brought the offering to the altar. Now it was up to the god to accept it. The serpent began to move toward Corbin, its massive body flowing over the lawn like a river of darkness. Corbin raised his revolver, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He knew it was useless. A handgun was a pea shooter against a creature of this size. But he had to do something. He couldn't die without a fight. He fired. The shot was deafening in the night air. The bullet ricocheted off the serpent's thick scales with a metallic ping. The creature didn't even flinch. It just kept coming. He fired again, and again. The bullets were useless. He had one shot left. He thought of his wife who had died 5 years ago. He thought of his desk calendar with the retirement date circled in red. He had been so close. As the serpent loomed over him, its massive head blotting out the stars, its jaws beginning to open, Corbin didn't aim for the creature. He aimed for the man on the porch. He aimed for the keeper. He squeezed the trigger. The final shot rang out. Arthur cried out and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. He collapsed onto the porch, the rifle clattering to the ground. The serpent stopped. It turned its massive head, its unblinking yellow eyes leaving Corbin and fixing on the fallen figure on the porch. Its master, its keeper, its other half was injured, bleeding. A low hiss, A sound of confusion and distress emanated from the creature. For the first time, its ancient, implacable gaze seemed to hold something other than hunger. Corbin didn't wait to see what it would do next. He scrambled to his feet and ran, his body screaming in protest, fueled by the last dregs of his will to survive. He ran down the long driveway, his lungs burning, his vision swimming. He reached the rusted gates and burst out onto the empty country road, not stopping until the manor was out of sight. He flagged down the first pair of headlights he saw, a pickup truck driven by a startled farmer. He had survived. The cavalry arrived at dawn. A fleet of state police cars, an ambulance, and an animal control unit armed with elephant tranquilizers. They found Arthur Penwright unconscious on the back porch, weakened from blood loss but alive. Of the serpent there was no sign. It had vanished back into the cavern from which it came. The house was a treasure trove of evidence. The journals provided a full confession to dozens of murders spanning generations. Forensic teams found human DNA in the cavern, confirming the horrific truth of what had happened there. Arthur Penwright, the last of his line, was arrested and, once recovered from his injuries, charged with a litany of crimes that would ensure he would never see the outside of a prison wall again. The biggest problem was the serpent. How do you deal with a creature like that? A team was sent into the cavern, but it was empty. A hidden underwater tunnel was discovered at the bottom of the pool, leading to a network of subterranean rivers. The creature was gone. It had abandoned the house, its home for over 100 years, and escaped into the wilderness. Corbin retired a week later. He didn't want a party or a pension dinner. He just wanted to go home. The official story was that Arthur Penwright was a serial killer who fed his victims to a large, illegally kept python. The more esoteric details, the pact, the symbiotic relationship, the strange intelligence in the creature's eyes, were left out of the official report. They were Corbin's ghosts now, his to carry. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain is tapping against his window, he thinks about the serpent. He wonders where it went, if it's still out there, somewhere in the deep, dark woods of the world, ancient and alone and hungry. And he wonders who or what is feeding it now.